If that is there, that means it's recording. Good? Okay, so you don't have to ask me every time. If that's there, it means it's recording. I will generally record this class and not the first one, because the second time is usually a little smoother than the first time, right? I figure out whether the jokes fall flat, try to work up another one in the interim. And a lot of times they do, because I like puns more than you do. I'm an 11-year-old. That's how we communicate. We just text puns back and forth. Okay, so there's a million ways to approach physiology. The way that I approach it is what I try to build for you, with you, is a big framework of how the entire body works. So what we're going to do is we're going to start saying, okay, we see this and we notice this pattern, and then we see a repeat of that pattern in another body system, right? And then we see a repeat of that pattern in another body system. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do far less memorization. We're going to discover repetitive patterns. We're going to note that they're repetitive. And it's going to give us the capacity to predict future things based on the past things that we've seen. For instance, one of the themes that we will see in physiology is negative feedback to maintain homeostasis, right? So for instance, with negative feedback, when a variable starts increasing above the norm, in order to maintain homeostasis, what would you do? You'd start bringing it back down, right? Does that make sense? And we will see that whether it's blood pressure or pH or body temperature or anything like that. So we'll start seeing patterns, we'll start emphasizing connections, and what you're going to get is a big picture that has a pretty strong framework, because there's no way that you can learn all of physiology. I sure as hell don't know all of physiology. Physiologists don't know all of physiology, but what you have is a big predictive framework which will allow you to put new information in. So for instance, if we said that, okay, cardiovascular system, if I told you that the overriding function of the cardiovascular system is to ensure adequate blood flow to capillary beds, right? Okay, that's the trump card, right, for the cardiovascular system. And I said, okay, so if that is the overriding functionality of the cardiovascular system, then I don't have to tell you that if, for instance, your heart rate dropped, right? If your heart rate dropped, you might need to increase blood flow to capillary beds by retaining water, right? By increasing the pressure. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? Or for instance, if I said, okay, we have a blood pressure problem. We have somebody with hypertension, right? They've got high blood pressure. And we want to drop the blood pressure. And a new drug just came out. And we didn't know about it because it's brand new, right? But we know, because we understand the cardiovascular system, that that blood pressure drug that is supposed to drop blood pressure will probably do what to your heart rate if it does anything? Decrease it. What will it probably do to your vessels? Dilate or constrict? Dilate. Does that make sense? And what will it do to your kidneys? Should it make you pee more or pee less? Pee more, right? Does that make sense? So what you want to do is you want to do that for the entire physiology system, right? You want to have a big picture understanding that you can add details in, and your big picture understanding is so strong that you know exactly where to put the next detail, right? So that's how I approach physiology. And what you're going to have to do is, a lot of times what I will do is what I just did then. I'll tell you a couple of things and then I'll ask you a question, right? Use the Socratic Method. This and then this, and what do you think next, right? And I don't care if you get it right or wrong. Getting it wrong is just as useful for learning the material, right? You're like, here's my guess, right? And then if your guess was based on an improper assumption, then you fix it, right? And then you give it back. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to get the tools to categorize new facts. We're going to go out on a limb even when it's uncomfortable to try to figure out what's going to happen next. If it was incorrect, we're going to fix it real time. So you are going to be required to think, test your knowledge, and give me feedback about your knowledge constantly. One of the reasons why we use the top hat is because introverts don't do that in class, right? Introverts do not answer questions aloud. They might answer them in their head, but do they need to in order to assess their own knowledge? Yeah, you actually do. You actually need to give it a shot, see if you get it wrong, right? But if you're not the one of the 5 people who answers every single question aloud, I still want you to get the benefit of giving it a shot. Does that make sense? Okay, so You will be required to think, test your knowledge constantly. Some people hate that about my classes because they're like, just tell me the damn material. You actually don't learn it as well if I tell you all of it. You learn it really well if I tell you A, B, C, and then ask you what you think D is, right? And then you're like, oh, I'm trying to put it all together and figure out why the hell I cared about A, B, and C. Okay, so what we're going to start with now is we're going to start with a really big important function in physiology, which is getting things to and from the right places. Okay, so we're going to go back to our Snickers bar metaphor, and we're going to say, okay, in phys, if I eat a Snickers bar, what I'm going to have to do is not memorize, but determine, figure out how I get the nutrients from that Snickers bar all the way to the cells of my little finger, right? So what we're going to do is in phys, there's a tremendous amount of moving things from point A to point B. And so there is going to be a what is moved. And the what, you've been a person for a long time, and you took 1610, so you won't be at all surprised that, of course, we need to absorb nutrients like glucose and amino acids, and you might even know why we need to absorb sodium and we need to absorb water. So the what's that we're moving won't be super surprising to you. The how's that we're going to move them, you might not have the capacity to predict yet, but you will. And then the whys are going to be part of physiology. So here's what would happen. So this is obviously not an anatomical drawing, and you will figure out that in phys books, they're like, oh, there's some anatomy, let's just make it a box. Who cares, okay? They don't care. So what we're gonna do is we're going to take in a Snickers bar, and we are going to, of course, break it down to its nutrients that can be absorbed. And let's concentrate on a single nutrient. Of course, it has proteins, there's peanuts in there, right? It's got fats, right? It's also got sugars, including glucose, right? And it's got some ions like sodium, right? Let's follow glucose, because everybody knows what glucose is for, I hope, okay? So here's what's going to happen in phys. Ready? What we're going to have to do is we are going to have to absorb it. In order to get anything into the body, you have to cross what kind of tissue? Epithelial tissue. Does that make sense? Of course, if we want it to be a transport surface, the epithelial tissue is likely to be thin or thick? Thin, yes? If we want a higher level of transport, should the epithelial tissue be curved? Yes, it should, to increase surface area. Does that make sense? The epithelial tissue like microvilli? Okay, so you guys remember that from anatomy. What we don't know yet, but you will, is what kind of transport would allow it to be absorbed. Do we need a channel? Do we need a carrier? Could it be absorbed by endo or exocytosis or osmosis? Not osmosis. It's a sugar. That's wrong. Okay. So what about, do I need ATP or not to absorb it, right? So that question will be answered right here, but then we didn't get it to our little finger yet. We need to know how it will traverse across this fluid, right? How about how I get it into the capillary? All of that is going to be based on the size of the molecule and the charge of the molecule and the concentration gradient of the molecule. And what will happen by the time we get finished with this first set of material is that, the first section before the first midterm, is that nobody will need to tell you transport mechanisms, because you'll be able to look and say, oh, that one's like the 72 other ones that we did. So now I know how I'm going to transport it. Okay. And then, of course, we're going to have to actually circulate it, right? Okay, and then we're going to have to get it back out. There's going to be a transport mechanism that you're going to learn here. And then we're going to have to get it into the cell. So why do you need glucose inside cells?
Energy.
Give me the phrase. What's it called? Yes, cellular respiration, exactly. Okay, in phys, if you don't know the answer, cellular respiration, homeostasis. Cellular respiration, homeostasis. I have no idea, but that's probably one of the answers. Cellular respiration, homeostasis. So cellular respiration to maintain homeostasis. So what we will do is we will get it all in there, and you will know what kind of transport it uses. And then we'll throw things at you like, oh, and by the way, if you actually want to get glucose from the extracellular fluid to the intracellular fluid in the vast majority of cells, it doesn't happen in the absence of insulin. So let's make this person a type 1 diabetic, untreated, who just ate a Snickers bar. Living on the edge, man. Okay? So now I want you to predict what will happen to the little finger cells of that type 1 untreated diabetic, right, after they ate a Snickers bar. What happens? Do the cells get any glucose? No, they get zero glucose. Can you predict for me what that will tell you about the level of glucose circulating in the bloodstream? It's going to be really high. Does that make sense? And then we'll treat them, and then we'll see what happens to the cell, and we'll see what happens to the bloodstream. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so we are going to do a lot of moving things around, but we're not going to memorize how they move. We're going to figure out how they move, right? Because the memorization won't stick with you very long. At least it doesn't stick with me very long. Okay, so let's talk about the primary places that you do exchange. The primary places that you do exchange are, of course, the gastrointestinal tract. That's where you get things in, right? Water and the vast majority of your nutrients come in that way, of course. But also the respiratory tract and the urogenital tract. Those are the in and the out places. They are really, really important because they do transport between the external environment and the internal environment. And FYI, if you swallow something and it doesn't get absorbed across that epithelium, it's actually not inside you. Even though it feels like it is, it ain't. So my brother used to feed me coins just as an experiment and then figure out how big a coin I could eat and then when it would come out. You would think he would end up a scientist, but he's actually a stockbroker. So apparently I cannot swallow a $50. But everything up to that I could, and he'd just wait for it to ping, and I'd have to report to him when it would come out. It never actually crossed an epithelium, so it didn't actually get inside my body, although it really felt like it was, FYI. So, 3. He's a jerk. What?
So maybe you could swallow him now.
Yeah, he doesn't have that kind of influence over me anymore. Okay, so it's not actually inside. So the other thing is that these epithelial surfaces are also really clinically important because if an epithelial surface, its purpose is actually transport, then you can't ever close it. Yes, that makes sense? And that means that it's a really, really good place to get pathogens. So what are the body surfaces that you're most likely to be exposed to pathogens? Isn't that them? GI, respiratory, and urogenital? Yeah. And why can't we close them? Because we actually wouldn't get the nutrients and gases or waste in and out if we did. So these are the systems that end up being both clinically really important because of pathogens and also clinically really important because of exchange of materials in and out of the body. Is that cool? Okay. So now, what we are going to have to do is we're going to have to acknowledge that the vast majority of the stuff that's being transported is being transported through fluid. So I know you've heard a million times that you are mostly fluid, right? Most of us are around 60% water. Our total body weight is around 60% water, and you can be more or less, and if you were a jellyfish, you'd be around 80. But you are around 60% water. So the water collectively is called total body water. So if you look here, this is the total body water. So like I said, these particular portions are not considered inside of the body. The rest of it is. So the total body water, which they just abbreviate TBW. I never use that acronym, but it's faster than writing total body water. Can basically be separated into 2 subcomponents. And these 2 subcomponents are the extracellular fluid. What does extra mean? Outside. Okay, so anything that is not inside a cell is considered extracellular fluid. And in phys, they refer to that as ECF. Okay, now, do you remember in anatomy that the extracellular fluid, for instance, remember looking at loose areolar connective tissue and I'm like, oh, that's a fibroblast and that's a collagen fiber. But what's between the fibroblasts and the collagen fibers? It is called tissue fluid or interstitial fluid. Does that sound familiar? Okay, before we go any further, inter, what does that mean? Between, not within. Okay, now always remember this because if you want to get out of Utah, what kind of highway do you get on? An interstate, yes, because it goes between states, right? Not within the states. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's interstitial fluid. It's sometimes called tissue fluid. It is a component of extracellular fluid. And this is fluid that surrounds any cell but blood cells. The fluid that surrounds blood cells is called what? Plasma, exactly. Okay? So these are the extracellular fluids, right? Okay. How much of your total body water is extracellular fluid? Look, ECF makes up about 14 liters of the 42. The rest is ICF. So let's talk about ICF. ICF is intracellular fluid. And intra means what? Inside or within, exactly. Now, in 1610, sometimes they call that cytoplasm or cytosol. In phys, they always refer to it as ICF. Is that okay? Okay, so now we have this water, but we know that we need for things to be able to be transmitted from one place to the other, right? Does that make sense to you? So what we are going to have is we're going to have two things that sound kind of like an oxymoron. We need to keep these separate but communicating, okay? So what we are going to have is we are going to have some boundaries that allow for separation with communication. So let's do this one first. Okay, see if you guys can remember. So there are circumstances, of course, in which I need to get something from the interstitial fluid into the plasma. Let's look back at our Snickers situation, and what's going to happen here is it's going to go from the lumen of the intestine into the interstitial fluid, yes? And then cross into the plasma. You guys with me? Okay, so that glucose is going to have to do that. In order to do that, tell me what physical structure it would have to cross. What physical structure represents the barrier between interstitial fluid and blood plasma? Physical structure. If I wanted to get something from the interstitial fluid into the plasma, it would have to cross what? Yeah, the capillary membrane. Do you guys remember what it's called, the capillary membrane? It's made of what kind of tissue? Capillary. Simple squamous epithelium. It's called the capillary endothelium. Okay, now, let's talk about this. Is interstitial fluid and blood plasma different? Well, yeah, it is, but it has to have exchange. Like, for instance, I don't want to lose my red blood cells that way, do I? Right? And I don't want to lose my clotting proteins that way, but of course I need to get glucose into here, right? Does that make sense? So what you need to have is you need to have the ability to control transport between those two things. Is that good? And you can control it with transport proteins like carriers and channels and holes and all that kind of stuff. Is that good? Okay, so there is exchange, but it's not willy-nilly exchange. It's controlled exchange between the two of them. And then this one should be more familiar to you. What is the physical barrier that separates the ECF from the ICF?
Cell membrane.
Yeah, that's a cell membrane, exactly. So we all know quite a bit about that, and we know the cell membrane is rather controlling about what it lets in and out, right? Do I want to lose a nucleus that way? No, but I certainly need to, for instance, get oxygen in for what's that process again? You're my favorite, Brady. Cellular respiration in order to maintain. There we go. You guys all passed. Okay, homeostasis. And I need to get carbon dioxide out, which was generated by cellular respiration, exactly. So I need to have things that are able to traverse, but I need to be able to control them. Okay, so concept for you. Let's talk about, the intracellular fluid, the ECF and the ICF have to maintain different concentrations of solutes and ions and waste products and nutrients. So the primary thing that they are going to control transport of are things that you're familiar with. Of course, you're going to control transport of nutrients, right? And you're going to control transport of waste products, right? And gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Everybody's cool with that, and most of you guys have an idea about why you're doing that. What may or may not be familiar to you yet is why we work super duper hard to control transport of ions, also called electrolytes. What we have to have is we have to, for instance, sequester the vast majority of potassium inside the cell and the vast majority of sodium outside the cell. And you may not know why yet, but you certainly will by the time we finish the semester. So it is so important to maintain this really selective permeability, this controlled exchange, that you actually end up spending about 60% of your ATP just on maintaining the composition, temperature, pressure, pH of these fluids. 60% of your ATP in order to maintain homeostasis of these fluids. But I have a question for you, and I don't care if you get it wrong. I just want you to sit and chew on it for a second. Okay, so if I told you that the body actually focuses on maintaining the composition, temperature, pH of one of these two fluids, either ICF or ECF, I want you to sit and think about which one. If the body really works on one of these two fluids instead of both of them, most consistently, Which one? So sit and think about it, and then if you have a hypothesis, you are welcome to come up with it. And there are arguments on both sides, but there is a right answer, okay? So come up with your hypothesis as to which one you're going to devote energy to maintain and assess. Brady says extracellular fluid. Do you have a reason?
Just because it includes the blood, which has to be at a certain temperature. Also, exchanges is being made from outside the cell into inside the cell.
Cool. Does anybody think it's ICF? Anybody? Go ahead. You have any idea or any reason why you think that?
Just because there's so much that happens inside the cell, metabolism.
Right.
If that doesn't happen, nothing else.
Okay, totally. Those are both totally good arguments. So let's talk about which one is actually true. So here's the deal. What you have as far as ICF is an adult, an 150-pound adult, has about 100 trillion individual pools of ICF. Okay, I want you to think about the efficiency of trying to maintain 100 trillion individual pools of ICF. Does that sound outrageously expensive and really inefficient? However, how many pools of ECF do we have?
2.
Yeah, 2 at the max, right? Okay, and there's transport between them, right? And in addition, aren't these pools circulating? 1/2 circulating pool, each of which is going to come into contact with every cell in the body ultimately, eventually, right? Does that make sense? So do you see the efficiency angle of monitoring ECF instead of ICF? Yes? Okay, and then there's one other reason. So his observation was actually really good. ICF is pretty damn important because if you mess with the ICF, you mess with cell function, right? And if you mess with cell function, you get into a pathophysiology situation. So I want you to imagine now that I have just ingested a poison, okay? And it is actually a metabolic poison, right? It's going to shut down the metabolism of my cell. Here's my question for you. Which fluid does it hit first, the poison?
ECF.
Hits the ECF first. Does that make conceptual sense to you guys? I ingested it and it hits the ECF before it hits the ICF. So when do you want to take care of the issues? When do you want to take care of excesses or deficiencies or temperature variations or pH variations? Do you want to, you want to take care of them as quickly as possible. Does that make sense? So what I'm saying is I am certainly not saying that the ICF is not caring about itself. Each little cell says, I only care about me, right? It's trying to maintain its own cell metabolism. But in addition to each cell only caring about number one, what we have, for instance, is chemoreceptors, for instance, in the aortic arch and the carotid bodies and a few other places that are constantly monitoring the carbon dioxide, the pH concentration, the oxygen concentration in the blood plasma, right? And they monitor it for the entire body, right? So if, for instance, I detected in the aortic arch that my carbon dioxide concentration was too high, how many cells could that potentially affect? All of them. So what would I do? I would trigger an increase in respiration for myself, for the whole damn body. Does that make sense? If, for instance, I had temperature receptors that were multiple places, they're usually in the bloodstream because they're detecting blood plasma, but they can also be in the interstitial fluid. If I detected that since I have some kind of pathogen, my body temperature was so high that my proteins were going to start denaturing, right? Does that make sense? I detected it there, then what would I do? I would trigger the brain to, for instance, increase vasodilation to the skin and activate the sweat response. Do I do it just for myself? No, I'm doing it for the whole body. So, socialism, capitalism, right? Got it? So the ECF is concerned about the entire system. Is that okay? Okay, so you spend about 60% of your energy supply maintaining these fluids. Okay, so physiology is still only partially understood. So are there going to be situations in which we don't know how something occurs? Fewer and fewer. Our realm of ignorance about human physiology is narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. But there will always be new information. I would like for you guys not to just be the passive passive consumer of information. But after you've gotten a little bit of information, I would love for you guys to be continuing to educate yourself about physiology. I'll give you some good resources to look for. I would like for you to be the best educated medical professionals possible because you're going to take care of me. And I ask hard questions of my medical professionals. They don't like it. Okay, so now, interactive physiology, whenever you see this, I don't know why it's upside down right there, but whenever you see that IP, it's telling you that there is a part of interactive physiology which covers exactly this. So if you know that you are a real kinesthetic person who needs to manipulate things, phys is difficult because you can't manipulate things as well. Interactive physiology allows you to have that connection. So if you know that you have a difficult time, I specifically tell you which pages in interactive physiology are good. I never test off of them, but if you start having trouble, especially when we get to endocrine system and cardiovascular system, I would highly recommend it. I think it's pretty good. Don't you, Brady? Do you like interactive physiology? Did you use it before? Yeah, I like it too. Okay, so we will start right here next time. What are my 2 goals for you for Wednesday? Top Hat and Melanie B. Yeah, cool. Okay, have a good few days.